In the last few videos, we've talked about different forms of biodiversity, genetic diversity, and species diversity, and functional diversity, and ecosystem diversity. And we talked about different biomes, deserts, and coniferous forests, and deciduous forests, and grasslands. And there are other ones as well, tropical rainforests, and coral reefs, and all these kinds of things. And now I'm going to introduce the idea that in all of these ecosystems, in all of these biomes, biodiversity is decreasing worldwide. As we have needed more and more natural resources to support human lifestyles, and as our population has grown, we've needed to expand out, we've needed to increase farming territory, we've needed to increase space that we use for urban development. We have been eliminating natural habitats and converting them over to human-used spaces. So the size of natural ecosystems, of natural biomes, has been decreasing, and with it has been decreasing species diversity, genetic diversity, ecosystem diversity. More and more and more of it's getting converted just over to urbanized, human-utilized space. And cities and those types of ecosystems only support a very small number of species. I believe I mentioned in an earlier video that we are currently, or many ecologists classify us currently, as undergoing the 6th mass extinction event in geological history. That is, the rate at which species are going extinct is about 1,000 times higher than the estimated background extinction rate. Because species do go extinct all the time naturally, but it seems like they are going extinct much, much more quickly than we would observe in the fossil record. And there is not a single ecosystem on the planet that is not affected by human activities. Now, knowing that, if we want to conserve as many species as possible, where do we focus our efforts? Because we only have so much funding and so much manpower, so much energy to be able to apply to this problem. You would want to apply as many resources as possible to the locations that have the highest biodiversity. So not every ecosystem is going to have an equal number of species, an equal amount of genetic diversity, an equal amount of species diversity. And some areas might have very high species diversity, but the species they have might be species that you could find many other locations as well. So you would want to apply your effort to what we call biodiversity hotspots. These are locations, ecosystems on the planet that have not only an extremely high species diversity, but where the species found there are also found nowhere else on the planet. Tropical rainforests are biodiversity hotspots. Coral reefs are biodiversity hotspots. Wetlands, many types of wetlands are biodiversity hotspots, although as invasive species have been moving into a lot of these areas, the overall biodiversity has been decreasing. And that's actually pretty common with a lot of these. The most biodiverse areas are often the ones that are disappearing the fastest, which then accelerates the rate of overall extinction. So conservation efforts often focus on relatively small areas that have a large number of endangered and threatened species, and those with an exceptional concentration of endemic species, that is, species found nowhere else on the planet. And the reason comes down, again, to economics. It is more efficient to apply your resources to, say, stopping habitat destruction in these locations, because habitat destruction here might affect 30 or 40 different species, whereas habitat destruction in another location might only affect 1 or 2 different species. So you're maximizing the number of species saved. And remember, earlier we discussed the concept of natural capital. Having a rich biodiversity increases the value of our investment in nature. And I again mean that in a very literal way. I am not only trying to appeal to those of you with a life-centered worldview who believe that saving species is a moral obligation. There are excellent selfish reasons for humans to want to preserve as many species as possible. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to use coral reefs as my example. Coral reefs are one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. They are marine ecosystems, saltwater ecosystems, and they represent a large portion of the total species richness of Earth. However, an estimated 20% of the world's coral reefs have already been destroyed by human activities. Water pollution, shipping traffic, oil spills coming through, over-harvesting, stress from climate change and ocean acidification, issues that we will talk about later on when we get into air and water pollution. These have overtaxed coral reefs to the point where they just collapse. 24% are in imminent danger of collapse in the near future. Another 26% may succumb in the next few decades if they are not protected. This means the majority of the world's coral reefs are in danger. 20% are already gone, and then another 50% are in a very precarious position. Now, we actually get food from coral reefs. There are fishermen that make their entire livelihoods getting food from these coral reefs. But as another example of some economic value that we get from coral reefs, I have a picture here of something called a cone snail, and this is an animal that lives in these coral reefs. And a cone snail is a predator. This is a snail, so a slow-moving invertebrate, as you might find in a garden. It's about the size of your hand, and it hunts fish. And if you can try to imagine a snail that hunts fish, it seems kind of perplexing, right? How could something moving that slow catch something that moves that fast? And the way that it does it is it takes this proboscis, this tongue-like structure, it takes it out and it wiggles it around, kind of like a lure, and it waits for the fish to get interested. And it has a something like a tooth inside this proboscis. And when the fish gets close to it, it harpoons the fish with the tooth inside this structure, and that toothy harpoon has a venom in it. That venom has a few different qualities to it. It paralyzes the fish. It renders the fish insensitive to pain, so the fish can't feel anything. So it's totally unaware of what's happening to it, and it makes the fish unconscious. So then the cone snail can just sort of slowly drift over to the fish, who's just lying down on the ground now, and then open up its big mouth and swallow the fish whole. Kind of a terrifying concept. Why am I telling you about it? Well, those three qualities of that cone snail venom, paralyzing, rendering you completely insensitive to pain, and knocking you out, are the holy trifecta of a really good surgical anesthetic. So some scientists got together and they started extracting compounds from the cone snail venom, and they started putting it together into a drug that could be used as a surgical anesthetic, and it's called Prialt, and it's on the market today. That's being used, and it is really good. If you've had other types of anesthetics you've gone under for surgery, it takes a while for them to put you under, and you get really, really groggy, and then it feels like you've been hit by a truck when you're waking up afterward. And some surgical anesthetics, it knocks you out, but some people are they're immune to the part that is supposed to numb you, so they, even though they're paralyzed, they might be awake, or even though they're paralyzed, they can still feel the pain. So having other options for surgical anesthetics is really, really important. And this is big money. The pharmaceutical industry is a very large portion of our economy. From what I've heard, when you wake up after having been dosed with Prialt, it feels like you've just had the best night of sleep in your life. Maybe that's effective advertising, but maybe it's true. But the fact remains, we got this drug by going into nature and finding compounds that we didn't know existed before. And that's almost always how we find new medications. Nature is the best chemist. If you think about it, if you want to create a new medicine for something, you have two basic strategies you could go through. You could randomly try creating compounds in different chemical experiments and giving them to, say, lab mice and seeing what happens. Or you could go looking in nature for compounds that already kind of do the thing that you're looking to do, and then alter those chemicals ever so slightly in different ways until they get the more precise effect that you're looking for. And that's more commonly what we do. We get drugs from tree bark, we get drugs from bacteria, from fungus, from snails, from all kinds of different organisms in these natural ecosystems. And that's just a couple of different compounds that were in the venom of one cone snail. Every species of cone snail has a different combination of compounds in their venom. So it could be that there's even better combinations or compounds with different medical effects that are already out there in these coral reefs waiting to be discovered. There are thousands of species of cone snails and related organisms that live in these coral reefs, every single one of them with a completely different set of venoms for hunting. Some of them don't even use venom. They use insulins they saturate the water with insulin in order to put the fish into like a diabetic coma, essentially, in order to hunt. So that's a completely different type of research that we could look into for medical purposes. If we were to lose all of these coral reefs, think of all of the products, medical products and other types of products that could have been produced that we will never have discovered because of the species that we would lose over time. So this is why I say, regardless of whether you have a life-centered worldview, as your book describes it in Chapter 1, or a human-centered worldview, as your book describes it in Chapter 1, there are very good reasons to want to preserve as many species as possible. Now, while we're on the topic of aquatic biomes, we should talk about the other kind of aquatic biomes, and then we can move on to talking about terrestrial biomes. So while terrestrial biomes, which are the land-based ones, are classified based on what the dominant vegetation is, cacti occur in deserts and pine trees occur in coniferous forests, the aquatic biomes are classified based on water quality, so physical factors about the water. Coral reefs are in a marine biome, saltwater biome, whereas lakes and rivers and streams, these are our freshwater biomes. And freshwater biomes cover only about 1% of the Earth. And if you know from earlier classes you've probably taken, like back in elementary school, 75% of the Earth's surface is covered in water, but only 1% of the Earth's surface is covered in freshwater. So it's a very small amount of the Earth's water is actually freshwater. And oceans are much deeper than lakes and rivers and streams are. So if you were to actually calculate the volume of freshwater compared to the volume of saltwater that we have, freshwater only accounts for 0.01% of Earth's water. And that's pretty staggering considering that's all of the water that we use for drinking, for crop irrigation, for sanitation, for industry, for using for if you want to make a soft drink or any other kind of product. We use fresh water for that. Obviously, we don't use salt water for that kind of thing. It's also all of the water that's used for any kind of terrestrial ecosystem, for forests, for inland wetland ecosystems, for deserts, for all of these various ecosystems that we discussed. They all use fresh water for that. They're all competing. Human industries and human societies, as well as all of these different ecosystems, competing for 0.01% of the Earth's water supply. And yet, freshwater ecosystems harbor about 6% of all described species. So they are a very, very important part of the Earth's total biodiversity. In this unit, we're going to concentrate more on the terrestrial ecosystems than we are on the aquatic ecosystems. Later on, we will discuss the damage to ecosystems that overuse of water resources does have, and the effects on human populations of depleted water resources. But I did want to take this opportunity to discuss how some ecological research is conducted and how it's different from other types of biology lab work that you might do, different from the classic scientific method that we discussed in an earlier video. These two photos at the top of the slide are both mine. They're both locations where I did a little bit of ecological sampling, and they're observational research. We're not doing an experiment, we're just going out to a location and we're seeing what kinds of organisms live in these locations. So on the left, it's a lake in the Pennsylvania mountains called Lake Lackawanna, and what I did was I took a rowboat out into the center of this lake and I dropped a metal device on a chain that kind of looks like a bear trap, if I'm honest. And it sinks all the way down to the bottom of the lake, and it scoops up, the trap closes, and it scoops up a sample of the mud from the very deep bottom of the lake. And then you drag that mud up into the bottom of your rowboat into a plastic bin, and then you sift through that mud using a graded sieve. And then you look for all of the invertebrates, all of the bugs and worms and things that live in that mud layer, in that deepest mud layer of the lake. If there's a high diversity of different organisms living in that mud layer, it means that the overall health of the lake is probably really good, that the overall biodiversity is really good. However, if you only have this one specific type of worm in there that are kind of blood red in color, it means that the dissolved oxygen at the lower levels of the lake is depleted, that you have very low oxygen content. And that in turn means that the physical conditions of the lake are not very supportive to life, that it's not a very healthy biome, it's not a very healthy ecosystem. The reason why this works is that every species has certain tolerances for physical conditions. You have a minimum amount of dissolved oxygen that you need to survive. And only certain species are going to be specialized to survive at the very lowest amounts possible. And the same goes for every other physical factor of the water. Only a very small portion of species are going to be specialists for acidic conditions, or specialists for high temperature fluctuations, where it goes hot and cold and things like that. So if you bring up a sample and it only has one or two species in it, it means that the only ones that were able to survive were the ones that are specialists for those bad conditions, for the really depleted, low oxygen, polluted conditions, or something like that. So you can use the species richness, or the biodiversity, to tell you about the overall health of the ecosystem, and then you can even use which species are there to tell you what specific factors are too high or too low in that ecosystem. On the right-hand side, I'm standing in a stream, and it looks like I'm wearing a Ghostbusters proton pack. It looks like I'm about to go hunt some ghosts here. And what I'm actually about to do is sample some fish. This is something called electrofishing, which you are absolutely not allowed to do unless it's for scientific educational purpose. And what you do is, this backpack has a couple of car batteries inside of it, and this pole that I'm holding, the little loop on the end, is electrified, and then there's a wire that's dragging behind me like a tail. And you walk up the lake, and you hold this electric pole in front of you, and it creates an electric current from in front of you to the wire behind you. And any fish that swims near you is going to pass through that electric field. And it's not enough to kill the fish, it's enough to stun them. And when a fish is stunned, they turn upward, and you can see their white belly. So then you get a couple of grad students on either side of you who are flanking you with fishing nets and buckets. And whenever they see that white belly, they know they can scoop up that fish and they can toss it in a bucket. So it's really easy to gather a whole bunch of fish really quickly using this method. You just walk up the stream and gather a whole bunch of fish in the buckets really, really quickly. And then you can go back on shore. You can count up how many fish you got and how many different species are represented. Then put all the fish right back in the water. They just had a really weird experience that they can go tell their fish friends about. And you do it again. You do a few different passes. You go to a different location on the stream. Keep working your way upstream so that you're less likely to sample the same fish over again. And eventually you get yourself a nice picture of what all of the different fish species are in the stream and what their relative ratios are. How many of the fish in the stream are this species, how many are this species, how many are that species, and so on. Again, this is observational research. We're not really doing an experiment where we have a control group and an experimental group that we're giving some sort of test factor and we're testing things out. We're just going to a location and we're trying to sample what's there. We're trying to find out what's there in order to determine the overall health of the ecosystem. And if you understand the relationship between biodiversity and the health of the ecosystem and what role various organisms play in their particular ecosystem, you can get a lot of information just by going there and seeing what's present. One more aquatic ecosystem that I want to talk about before we transition to terrestrial ecosystems, and appropriately, it is wetlands, because wetlands are transitional biomes between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. They are the bridge between these two realms. If you're not sure what a wetland is, commonly it's an area where there is shallow standing water more or less all the time. So something like a swamp is a wetland. But it also might just be a floodplain, like a wide floodplain. So it might be actually dry for large portions of the year, and then when you have a large rain event, it becomes an area of shallow standing water. These are going to be low-lying areas that are typically close to some other water source, like a lake or a river. Typically, when I talk about wetlands, I'm referring to freshwater wetlands because that's just what I'm more familiar with, but there are saltwater wetlands as well. Now, wetlands are very important ecosystems because you have species from the aquatic ecosystem, say from the freshwater ecosystem, the lake that's nearby, that can come into the wetland. They can, fish can swim into the wetland and then back into the lake. So you have those species represented in the wetland. You have species from the terrestrial ecosystem, like trees periodically will kind of transition into this wetland, and other types of vegetation from the terrestrial areas are also located right around this area. So you have a joining of these two different areas of biodiversity in this one location, but you also have species that are wetland specialists, species that only occur in wetlands that do really, really well in these shallow waters. You also have organisms that migrate. For example, migratory birds like ducks and geese and things like that, herons, are going to land in these wetlands as their stopover points. So not only do you have three pools of biodiversity, aquatic ecosystem, terrestrial ecosystem, and the wetland specialist biodiversity all in this one location, but you also get those visitors from other areas that are merging biodiversity from other ecosystems. So you get some of the most biodiverse spots in our area, all in these wetlands. So these are biodiversity hotspots. And because they serve as stopover points for migration, if you eliminate a wetland, say you fill in the wetland and put in a shopping mall, something like that, or a residential housing area, that eliminates a pit stop location for a lot of these migratory birds. And that means that they're going to have to spend a lot more time flying before they can take their next break. And that's going to be very, very stressful. It's going to mean that fewer members of that population are going to survive the trip. And that can end up reducing the overall survival rate of the flock that's migrating. And I believe this is one of the first times that we've seen something that could occur at a local scale that starts to affect biodiversity in other ecosystems, in other locations. And it's very unfortunate that a lot of wetlands are located in the same places where we would like to build cities or suburban areas. They're located nearby large water sources. That's where we like to put urban areas. and they are in fact being converted over for development at a faster rate than other types of ecosystems. So we are losing a lot of wetlands to habitat destruction. You may recall from an earlier unit, I talked about one of the ecosystem services that wetlands provide. They store excess stormwater from large rain events, and they prevent that stormwater from being delivered to a city all at once, which then means that the city doesn't need to have as large of a stormwater mitigation system, as much infrastructure built up for that, which reduces the overall cost of building that city, or of rebuilding that city if you fill in the wetland. So in terms of species richness, in terms of ecosystem services, wetlands are very, very valuable from a natural capital perspective. Now in the next video, I will talk about more specifically the terrestrial biomes and the physical factors that cause one terrestrial biome to become dominant versus another terrestrial biome. And again, terrestrial biomes are the land-based biomes.